All right, hello, and thank you for joining us at today's Hurricane Preparedness webinar and Outlook for the 2021 hurricane season. I am Cortland Keith, the VP of Cross Industry with StormGeo, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded and we will share it via email. If you have any questions, you can type them in the Q&A box and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to give a little background on StormGeo. StormGeo is a global company, one of the largest commercial weather providers in the world. Recently acquired by Alfa Laval, StormGeo is a leader in weather intelligence and advanced data science solutions with offices around the globe, including 8 regional forecast centers. We provide specialized 24/7 decision guidance to help customers mitigate risk, improve safety, and make sustainable choices on routes and operations. We support a wide variety of industries, including shipping, where we support 12,000 vessels and about 65,000 voyages are routed annually. We support renewables, where we're doing wind and social energy in Europe with about 9,000 unique forecasts issued per month. Oil and gas, we serve about 1,400 offshore installations daily with about 90,000 plus unique forecasts issued per month. Our cross-industry sector, we support 23,000 forecasts are issued daily to our US locations, with about 74,000 additional assets monitored and reported on daily. And lastly, we do have media solutions, where we have 20 million plus unique consumers serviced worldwide daily, with scalable solutions with multi-language support and relevant content. Now, I have 3 members of the StormGeo team joining me today. We have Cameron Self, a meteorologist and hurricane specialist. He will be giving us an overview of the current hurricane season, outlook, and discuss some of the questions you should be asking your meteorologist about the forecast. Rick Scott will be discussing climatological trends to watch out for, their implications to your business, and how your organization should respond. He is our senior industry manager specializing in the oil and gas industry and is also a trained meteorologist. Lastly, we have Mike Vensky, our account services manager and leader of StormGeo's client resiliency program. He will provide us with our top hurricane preparedness tips for the job site and for your employees' homes. I will also be sharing with you an interview I pre-recorded with Jason Barrio, the VP of Plant Operations with TECO, the Thermal Energy Corporation, about lessons learned from previous storms. We have a great set of presentations today, and we expect to be done by around 12:30. So let's get started. Cameron, I'm going to turn control over to you.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. Are we seeing my screen?
We are.
Okay. All right, well, as Cortland said, my name is Cameron Self. I'm one of the hurricane specialists on the ocean team here at StormGeo. And first, we're going to talk about this hurricane season. And actually, I'm going to start by talking about last hurricane season, last year's forecast. So first of all, we did forecast an above average season, but the season ended up being pretty hyperactive. It was the most active on record. And many of these storms, you notice we had 30 named storms last year. There were a lot of weak storms, but there were also quite a few strong ones as well that made quite an impact. And putting your attention over to the map here, you'll notice these yellows and reds. And what this shows is where we were forecasting above normal activity and where we were forecasting near normal activity. There really wasn't a location that we were expecting below normal risk for hurricane activity. But you'll notice where these hurricanes made landfall were primarily in this red region. And so the way we determine the regions of highest risk is by analog years. What years had a similar pattern to what we are experiencing now, and where were the hurricanes in that year? Now you'll notice up here along the East Coast, north of North Carolina, we had them in a normal risk. And from this map, you see that they didn't get a direct hit. However, if we look at where the impacts occurred, you'll see that we had tropical storm warnings that went all the way up to Maine. And that is because Isaias, yes, it hit down here by North Carolina, but it went all the way up the East Coast. And so just because it didn't necessarily hit up here first, storms that hit down in the south can move north and impact places far from the landfall location. Now, why are we forecasting a more active season? Well, one, we are monitoring the multi-decadal oscillation in the Atlantic, which technically has been showing some signs of going into the cool phase, but it's really been showing that for a few years now. And so it's really questionable as to whether or not this is going to really be impacting the hurricane season. So far, it really has not, and the Atlantic really has refused to go into this cooler phase, even though at times it looks like it's going to. But we have no El Nino this season. Typically, El Nino helps to increase the upper level wind shear across the deep tropics. And when you have that upper level wind shear, the tropical waters could be boiling. They could be really hot, but if your upper level winds are unfavorable, you're just not going to get that much activity. And speaking of those warm waters, they are quite warm. So that coupled with less wind shear expected this year would normally equate to a more active than normal season. Also, going back to those analog years that we use to look at where the storms occur, the analog seasons are showing that we're more likely than not to have a more active season than normal. And then also, we're just detecting storms better. There are storms that get named these days that wouldn't be named years ago because we can now detect them. We can see them on satellites. And so that also impacts, what the average number of storms is across the Atlantic. So looking at this year, once again, we are forecasting an above normal season, 19 named storms. The normal is 14, 9 hurricanes, normal 7, 5 intense hurricanes, normal is 3. And you'll notice that the above normal area actually extends further north this year, but we are expecting maybe more near normal conditions down in the Caribbean. And so last year we were thinking was a pretty big year for the deep tropics. This year we're thinking maybe the activity could be shifted just a little bit to the north. But once again, the Gulf of Mexico appears to have an above average risk, Florida, much of the East Coast, and the Western Caribbean. Now, if we go into what these probabilities look like for specific areas, this is the probability of a hurricane passing within 50 miles of a state. The blue lines show what is normal, and the red lines show what is forecast. And so Florida, which is the most vulnerable state in the United States, typically has a 58% chance of a hurricane passing within 50 miles of them. So already the chance is pretty high in Florida, even in a normal year. In 2021, though, we're thinking that's going to be a 75% chance. And you'll notice across the board, these numbers are higher than climatology. And then as we look into the probability of a major hurricane, Florida, once again, normal is 28%, but this year we're thinking there's a 41% chance of a major hurricane passing within 50 miles. You notice for most states, the red line is higher than the blue line. So the risk in general is higher this year. Now, what is going on across the tropical Atlantic today? We do have 2 disturbances that we are watching. Disturbance 9 is moving into the Eastern Caribbean right now. And then we have Disturbance 10, which came off the coast of Africa a few days ago. And if we put this map into motion, you can see that we do have some scattered shower and thunderstorm activity right in here associated with our disturbance 9. The good news is it is running against a lot of wind shear in the Caribbean. And although there were some computer models a few days ago that showed that once it got into the Western Caribbean where conditions are more favorable, it might have a chance to develop, those models have backed off for now, but we're still going to watch it. Really, when you start getting deep into the hurricane season, you really have to be watching all of these disturbances, which is what we do. Disturbance 10 is down in this area, and you'll notice we even have another complex of thunderstorms coming off the west coast of Africa. And one thing that we've noticed this season is these, we call them tropical waves or tropical disturbances. They've been fairly impressive looking for so early in the season. Fortunately, the environment out in this part of the Atlantic, we call it the MDR, the main development region. This early in the season, it's not a very favorable region, which is why we have not seen development, even with these impressive looking disturbances. However, if this were to continue, if we were to continue to see these impressive looking disturbances coming off the coast of Africa later into the season when conditions are more favorable, then that would be a red flag, and that would further support the idea of a more active than normal hurricane season. If one of our disturbances were to get named, the next name on the list is Danny. We just had Claudette, and we've already had Bill and Anna as well. So we're already on the D name storm in late June. I was asked to prepare a part of my presentation to talk about what are the questions that I frequently get from clients. And the reality of the situation is our clients are so diverse and have so many different interests that really the questions range quite a bit. But there were three categories that I did feel that there was a lot of overlap between the clientele, no matter the industry that they are in. One of those themes is timing. The other is severity. And then last but not least is uncertainty. So regarding timing, these questions are often in two different categories. One is more a business continuity perspective, while the other one is more about the safety of the personnel. So for the business continuity, we do these things called trigger reports, and we help clients identify what their trigger or what their threshold is in order to activate their response plan. So maybe they are on a site that can't operate when the winds get above a certain level. That would be a trigger. Maybe if the tide gets high enough, it actually starts covering roads nearby. That could be a type of trigger or threshold. And so oftentimes we're talking about at what time do we expect those conditions to be met, so they know that they need to go ahead and have their response plan active, because they're likely going to have to shut down during that time if we do expect those conditions to be met. There are also certain thresholds that may not necessarily have to be that are not directly related to the client, but they could be located in a place that, say, has bridges, and the local government policy in that county or town or municipality says that these bridges have to close down when the winds reach 40 miles per hour. And so oftentimes the client is asking questions about winds reaching a certain threshold that result in people not being able to get to work, or perhaps they even get trapped and they can't use the bridge to get off the island. We'll get more into that with safety. Another very, very common timing question is, what is the last and first good weather day, morning, afternoon? When is just like that last time that I can make all of my preparations? You hear this a lot if you're dealing with aviation. What is the last good day of flying weather? So this is an extremely common question. And then also, just in general, guidance to minimize the longevity of closure. Our clients, they want to be the last to close and the first to open. So how long can we wait until we close? And then how early can we open when things are back up to normal again? But there's also a safety component about this. This isn't necessarily all about money. You don't want your employees to get trapped on site. You don't want your employees to be driving during times in which the weather is hazardous. And so a lot of these people are coming from a perspective of protecting their coworkers. Also, you could have a location that is particularly prone to a certain hazard. So perhaps we're operating some sort of crane that it becomes just downright dangerous to be around when the winds get particularly high. You don't want your employees to be anywhere near that crane or anywhere near danger when those thresholds are being met. And then also, I repeated this same point from business continuity for a reason. For a reason, last and first good morning, day, afternoon. That is also a safety concern. The last day that we can fly, you don't want human beings in the sky when you have bad weather. So that's very much a safety concern as well. Also, severity. How bad is it going to get? Not just am I going to reach this trigger, but how far above that trigger are we going to go? How far above that threshold are we going to accomplish? And this can really help determine whether or not personnel stay behind. You may have some essential personnel that ideally you would like to stay on site. And if conditions are going to be to where you could hunker down and ride out the storm safely, then perhaps you keep the people there and the storm is not going to be so severe to where you have to evacuate everybody, or the opposite could be true. Perhaps you need to get everybody out. Also with severity, one thing that you hear a lot is the worst part of a hurricane isn't even necessarily the hurricane itself, but it's the recovery time afterward. It's dealing with the aftermath. And if we're dealing with a particularly severe storm, it's not just going to be about the timing of the winds, how high the winds get, how bad is the surge. It's also going to be a very long recovery time well after the storm. And then also we have a lot of clients who will invoke a past storm. Is this going to be like Harvey? Is this going to be like Katrina? In general, it's good practice to not make these comparisons because every single storm is different, and people who have been through multiple hurricanes will know that each of them have been very different in many ways. And so it's really good to communicate that to clients that each storm is different. Now, the other category is perhaps the questions we get most, and that really has to do with uncertainty. What is our forecast confidence? We have a storm that's moving into New Orleans, but couldn't it easily go east? Couldn't it easily go west? And so we are constantly trying to find ways to better communicate this uncertainty to clients. And this really goes into questions regarding the forecast philosophy. When you are trying to make a really big business decision, sometimes just hearing what the forecast is isn't enough. You want to know more. You want to hear the justification, the argument behind why we think the storm is or is not going to hit you. I have had a client one time ask me to show him a satellite image and point out the different features that we were talking about. I think his wording was, prove to me that there is a cold front that's coming down and is going to help scoop the storm up to the north and prevent it from going into the northwest Gulf of Mexico. And that client had really big decisions that he had to make. And so therefore he wanted more than just a track and a cone. He wanted to hear the forecaster say why we think it's not going to hit him and give him that argument, give him a compelling argument that the storm was going to be staying to his east. Also, our clients watch TV, they're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, and sometimes they see things that either are contradicting or maybe they just appear contradicting to what they see on our forecast. And sometimes it could be a difference in tone. I think sometimes when you're in the media space and you're just really trying to get people to pay attention to the storm, there could be a certain amount of hype that gets into the tone. We don't really hype things. We just tell people how we see them, how it is. We're typically pretty calm on the phone. And so, sometimes we have people asking about things that the guy on TV said, but the social media space by far has more of the contradicting things than the actual TV media space. And I think a really good example of this is the publicly available model data, such as this spaghetti plot you see on here. So you see you have all these models that say different things. So this has some pretty good consensus over Florida. But likely what happened that day when these models came out is you probably had someone on Twitter who's up in North Carolina share some pictures of this model, the GFDL model. And Storm Geo, more than likely, I believe this is Irma, had a storm going into South Florida. However, there were likely clients going on Twitter seeing a hurricane hitting North Carolina because someone was sharing some model imagery of the GFDL. And so we'll often get calls about that. I saw this on Twitter. This says it's going to hit North Carolina. And this goes back into our forecasting philosophy and telling people why we're forecasting, what we're forecasting. And this also goes into my next point, percent chance of a specific scenario. So say you have that client up in North Carolina talking about this model that they saw on Twitter, having it hit North Carolina. They might ask something like, okay, what is the percent chance or the likelihood or unlikelihood that it could take a track like this? And with a storm that is recurving, such as Irma, at this point when Irma was still down in the Caribbean, there was certainly a chance that maybe high pressure over here could have been a bit weaker and it could have helped the storm curve a little bit faster. That wasn't the likely scenario, but technically that was a possibility. There was a small chance of that. And so communicating that uncertainty is probably one of the more challenging things we do at Storm Geo. And it's not really even just at Storm Geo, just in meteorology in general. Communicating uncertainty is difficult. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that we communicate it in the simplest way as possible. And then if clients ever have any questions, we highly encourage them to call us. We have meteorologists available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So you can just pick up the phone. If you have any questions, you can call us anytime. And speaking of questions, that is the next part of this presentation. Do you have any questions for me?
Yes, thank you, Cameron. So as Cameron mentioned, we'll now take a few questions. Being one of our meteorologists, he does need to sign off early. So if you do have any questions about the forecast or what you saw today, please go ahead and enter those in the Q&A box. We'll do a quick Q&A session now. We do have one question, Cameron. Can you explain a little more about, what a particular location in the cone means for potential impacts?
So the cone of uncertainty technically does not really tell us a whole lot about impacts. What the cone of uncertainty tells us is a probable range of where the storm, where the center of the storm could track. So say you have a track that shows a storm hitting Mobile, but the cone ranges from Pensacola to Biloxi, Mississippi. What that means is that it is probable that the storm could track as far to the west as Biloxi or as far to the east as Pensacola, Florida. And in terms of the impacts, of course, the impacts span far outside of the center of circulation in many of these storms. And so New Orleans in this case would be outside of the cone, but you could have a storm hit Biloxi and New Orleans is still getting heavy rain bands. Tallahassee is outside the cone in that scenario, but a storm that's hitting Pensacola could easily have impacts that expand all the way to Tallahassee, Florida. So when we're looking at the cone of uncertainty, we need to remember that it's really all about the track, but not necessarily about the impacts.
Great, thanks, Cameron. We do have another question here. Are there any models that StormGeo relies on more or less, or is it more just related to consensus of multiple models?
It's more consensus, but I will say when we are going into more longer term forecasts, like say 5 days and beyond, we do really like the ensemble data. So a lot of what you will see, speaking of when I was talking about the social media post, is people will show what one computer model says 10 days into the future. But really that looking at one computer model 10 days into the future is borderline meaningless. However, we have these things called ensembles, which basically take a computer model, tweak the initial conditions a little bit, and then run it a bunch of times. And that really gives us a probabilistic outlook on what could happen into the future. And in general, I would say the ensembles are a pretty good product for the long range. They can't necessarily tell you that there will definitely be a storm in X location in 10 days, but the ensembles can give you a really good idea of where the more favorable region is going to be in the 5 to 7 to 10 day time frame. So I would say that as you go farther out, the ensembles, which technically are a more consensus type product, is something that we lean on more than say some of the other model products that are available to us.
Okay. Another question here about hurricane models. Will hurricane models improve? Because many times you do see a wide spread of tracks.
So the short answer is yes. We have seen improvement in hurricane models as recent as maybe 15 years ago. I think that the Hurricane Center was only doing a 3-day track, which seems crazy to us now. But that was because that was where the skill was at 15 years ago, and that was a function of where the computer models were at. And so although there is that spread, believe it or not, the spread was actually quite a bit larger just 10, 15 years ago. So they have improved, and I expect that they will continue to improve with time. I don't think we'll ever get to a point to where they'll be perfect, but I certainly expect improvement over time.
Great. Great. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you for your time. I think we're going to move on now. If you did ask a question and we haven't answered it yet, we will also do a Q&A session at the end. So don't think that, we're moving on without answering your question. So it's time to move on to the next topic. If we didn't, again, keep posting your Q&A questions in the box. Rick, I'm looking forward to hearing about the climatological trends businesses should be considering in their response plan. So you can go ahead and share your screen and we'll pass the control over to you.
Okay, good day, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Let me know when you can see my screen.
We can.
All right. Well, thanks, Cameron. I appreciate that, and Cortland. My portion of the webinar is going to be focused on the trends that we're seeing in tropical systems centered around climate change. And along with those trends come certain implications. And once we understand the implications of the changes in tropical characteristics and hurricane characteristics, we can sort of start to develop some type of a response. So we're looking at the big picture here, not this season or next season, but what we're going to be seeing over the coming decades. And these are based on real, quantifiable, measurable trends. It all started around 50 years ago when once we had satellites, we were able to notice a pretty strong connection between tropical development and the temperature of the oceans. Most of you are probably aware that's around 80 degrees Fahrenheit is usually given as the cutoff. Colder than that, it's difficult for a tropical system to develop. And once it reaches 80, there's enough evaporation and fuel for the system to develop if other conditions are favorable. Climate models have been improving rapidly over the last several decades, and we're able to simulate some of this tropical cyclone, some of the trends by tweaking the amounts of, the temperature of the atmosphere and the temperature of the oceans, and get a feel for what we might see. And when those match up with our trends, we have a little more confidence that we're seeing real trends. The third bullet here, while there's a pretty strong scientific argument for man-made climate change, it's not really important in the discussion today because the trends really are observable and measurable, and we need to address them and mitigate them as best we can. So I've kind of categorized these trends into 4 groups that I'll go over in the next several slides. Greater intensity and more rapid intensification, more storm surge, higher storm surges, a slowing of the forward speed of a hurricane, and then a longer season. And so I'll go over these one at a time. I think everybody remembers Laura from last year, went from just a weak a tropical storm to a strong Category 4 in a day and a half. And this is a trend that we're noticing, that storms are exhibiting more rapid intensifications. Last year, we categorized 10 of the 30 storms as intensifying rapidly or explosively. Tropical models also predict not just the rapid intensification, but increasing cyclone intensities, somewhere between 1 and 10%. So, I know that's a wide range, but there's a lot of different climate models, but we see them predicting increasing cyclone intensity. So the implications are somewhat obvious. You're going to have more impact with stronger storms, but keep in mind that first bullet under implications, when the increase of the destructive power is actually the cube of the speed. Here's a quick example. If you have say a Category 2 storm, we Category 2, 100 miles an hour, that intensifies to 110 miles per hour. So you might think, well, from 100 to 110, we can handle that. That's not that big of a difference, but it's actually the cube of that. So if you cube 100 and you cube 110, there's actually a 33% increase in the destructive potential of the wind. So the takeaway there is small increases in wind speed can translate into very large wind impact potential. And with the rapid intensification, obviously the implication is you have less time to prepare. But you see a storm out there, it's a Category 2, you want to be thinking about rapid intensification and being prepared for more of an impact. So what do you do? What's the response? A lot of this would be in your hurricane response plans. So for those of you who are in companies that have HRPs, you'd want to set your triggers at a lower threshold. So maybe you're waiting for a certain percentage probability of impact. You might set that trigger at a slightly lower percentage, maybe from 20% certainty to 15% certainty. Also, you might want to accommodate the worst case scenarios more objectively in your response plans. So since we're seeing these rapid intensifications, your hurricane response plans should reflect and accommodate those potentials for increase. Second trend that we're seeing is about storm surge. Since 1993, we've seen an increase in sea level rise, or an increase in sea level of 3.5 inches. Doesn't seem like much, but for a very gradually increasing slopes and coast along the Gulf Coast, 3.5 inches can mean a lot. We're seeing more storms producing extreme storm surge in the last 65 years. That's compounded by the sea level rise. So the implications, we already know the storm surge causes more casualties than really any other effect in a tropical cyclone. With greater storm surge and the sea level rise, you're going to see increasing property and infrastructure damage over the coming decades. So the water is going to be a little bit farther inland. It's going to be a little bit deeper, and that can cause real issues that we need to address. The responses are multiple here. Certainly from your weather provider, we want to make sure that we're on top of this and we're giving you better storm surge predictions and warnings. So we're aware of these trends and we want to make sure that you're notified of that. From an environmental standpoint, there's a lot of destruction going on of some of the natural barriers like coastal wetlands and dunes and barrier islands and reefs. And we need to do what we can to help preserve those natural barriers. When possible, we may be able to actually improve the infrastructure at our facilities, elevating things, strengthening some of the structures that could be affected by storm surge, constructing dams and barriers. And then lastly, better education is always going to help. And with increasing storm surge, there might be some changes in evacuation logistics. And real quick, I was doing some math along the Gulf Coast. 3.5 inches of sea level rise in a lot of areas can be as much as 1/3 of a mile of increased inundation. So 1/3 of a mile could be 4 or 5 blocks, city blocks, that are getting inundated by storm surge. Everything else being equal, that weren't affected previously. So this is a big one. The next one has to do with the speed of a storm. The trends that we're seeing are that steering winds are slowing down due to climate changes. There's some complex issues there that I'm not going to take time in this forum. But slower steering winds means slower hurricanes. And I think it's obvious a slower moving storm is going to sort of add insult to injury. So the trends there, tropical cyclone speed is decreasing by 10% since 1949. With the warmer atmosphere and the warmer ocean water, you're getting more evaporation, and then the warmer air can actually hold more water vapor also as it expands. And that's leading to a trend of about 4 to 9% increase in rainfall. The implications are more flooding, more river and flash flooding from these storms. Longer duration of winds. If you have a slower storm, you're going to have a longer duration of wind speed over an area, which potentially means more wind damage and more storm surge, as I mentioned in the previous slide. So the response, again, some of that falls on us, a better prediction of the rainfall rates and totals that we provide to our clientele. Also more closely monitoring the river levels, creeks and bayous from the increased rainfall, better flood warnings. We want our response plans to focus a little bit more on the rainfall and flooding. And I think many of you have made these changes since Hurricane Harvey in 2017, realizing that hurricanes are not always wind events. Often the rainfall and flooding has a much greater impact than the wind itself. And lastly, designing structures to handle more of the flooding, just like we did with storm surge, and being able to withstand longer wind duration. The last trend I'll mention is certainly timely this year again. Here we have the 7th consecutive year with storms occurring before June 1. And yeah, some of that may be related to better detection of storms, but that's just part of it. Climate models suggest hurricane seasons increasing by about 20 days on the front and end for every 1 degree of 1 degree Celsius of increased water temperature. As far as the actual number of hurricanes, that's not as straightforward. We're not really seeing that a warming climate will mean more hurricanes, but it does, that the climate models do indicate that the most extreme storms will become more frequent, and that's not a good trend. So the implications of a longer season would be obviously you're going to have earlier storms developing with less notification, later storms developing when maybe you're kind of ready for the season to be over. So these longer seasons sometimes result in kind of a burnout, a company-wide burnout, what we call response fatigue. What we can do, just being aware of it, is sometimes 75% of the response, but not waiting till June 1 to begin preparation. Many of you conduct drills, and I think it's wise to start scheduling these a few weeks earlier. Just being ready a few weeks earlier, and making sure that your employees are ready for a longer season, that they're more resilient, that the hurricane preparedness education has reached everybody earlier. So those are the trends that we're seeing. Kind of in summary, I would say that research suggests there's been an increase in intense hurricane activity in the North Atlantic since the 70s. It doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be more hurricanes, but we do think there's going to be more intense hurricanes with rapid intensification, higher wind speeds, slower forward speed, more precipitation and flooding. These are all kind of connected, greater storm surge, and a longer season. And just as a kind of in a nutshell, we want to have better predictions and warnings for these trends, more consideration given to these trends in our hurricane response plans, and when possible, improving the design of natural and physical structures. So that is the end of my portion of the webinar, and I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right, Rick, thanks for that. We will save the Q&A at the end, so be prepared for questions directed towards you. I'm excited to share our next session with you. We actually pre-recorded this interview with Jason Barrio at TECO. They are a provider of heating and cooling services to the entire Texas Medical Center in Houston. His team needs to be ready to ride out a storm and ensure operations continue throughout any storm. So he shared some great advice about their preparedness and lessons learned from previous hurricane events. Take a look. Hi, everyone. We have Jason Barrio, VP of Plant Operations at TECO with us. I'm Cortland Keith, VP of Cross Industry at Storm Geo. Hi, Jason. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, and thank you for allowing me to join you today.
Yeah, so we want to get to know a little bit more about your hurricane preparations. So why don't you start by telling us about, what TECO does, where you're located, and what are your responsibilities as an organization?
Okay. TECO, also known as Thermal Energy Corporation, we're a district energy plant located in Houston's Texas Medical Center. TECO is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, and our primary mission and focus is to serve chill water and steam to 49 different hospitals and buildings. They are comprised of 17 different institutions down at the Texas Medical Center. These institutions are a combination of research facilities, hospitals, and schools for education.
Great. So lots of responsibility. So given that you are in the Texas Medical Center, which is one of the largest medical centers in the world, how much do they rely on TECO, and why is it important that you stay operational during these weather threats?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as the district energy plant or the central plant for all these buildings, we are the sole provider of both steam heating and chill water cooling to these buildings. If we aren't 100% reliable or 100% online, then there is no cooling, there is no heating. So as I mentioned, we support the hospitals and the research facilities. Without the proper cooling and the proper heating, they can't do their research and they can't care for the patients. So reliability is our top priority. We have to be online and available 100% of the time. And it's kind of cliche, but for TECO, failure is truly not an option.
Understood. So given your kind of placement in Houston, Texas, obviously hurricanes are a big issue. So what kinds of advanced preparations do you conduct prior to hurricane season for your facilities, and also to make sure that your employees are prepared as well?
We start off in April, starting to be aware of hurricane season approaching. Around April 15th of every year, we will start inventorying our hurricane supplies. We have hurricane lockers, we have flood lockers, We'll inventory those to make sure that all the supplies are there. We'll run them to make sure they're in good working order. We'll replace any parts or supplies that we need. We also conduct annual training prior to June 1st. So in May is usually our storm season training. And we'll educate the employees on, lessons learned from the previous year's experiences, upcoming storms. We'll really tell them what the names are. The purpose of that training is just as a reminder that hurricane season is coming, and to remind them to be prepared to either come to work or to know their evacuation routes should a hurricane or a storm impact the Texas Gulf Coast. It's real important that the employees stay safe and are prepared for any type of storm that comes through during these seasons.
Got it. Okay. So then as, say, a storm is coming closer or it's been identified to impact the Houston area, what kinds of advanced preparations do you conduct closer to that storm impacting you at your facilities? Yeah,
so we have a natural disaster policy which covers hurricanes, tropical storms. It covers tornadoes, freezing weather, but we'll dust off our natural disaster policy at the beginning of hurricane season just to review it. We've got 5 conditions that we enter here at TECO. Condition 1 would be where we break out the policy and start reviewing the preparations. And that's what we would enter if we see that there's a storm that's entered the Gulf and is tracking towards the North Texas Gulf Coast. Those preparations consist basically of going out and looking at our inventories, making sure that we have a storm crew identified. We'll start looking at topping off tanks, looking at inventory levels. We've got diesel fuel tanks here on site. We'll get those filled full. We'll look at our chemical inventories. We make arrangements to have any chemicals needed to be delivered prior to that. But that's really the heightened awareness stage is when we enter condition 1. And again, like I say, that's when a storm enters the Gulf. As the storm continues to threaten our area, the National Hurricane Center will enter a hurricane watch. And a hurricane watch is when we get digging a little bit more serious. We'll start notifying the storm crew. They'll take more preparations. We'll start putting up flood barriers. We'll start getting equipment out and kind of getting in that pre-positioning for a storm. If the storm continues on, the National Hurricane Center enter a storm warning. That's where we start buttoning up the hatches. We'll notify the storm crew members to go home, make sure that their houses are in good condition so that they can leave and come back to work. And then the other employees that are here, we'll send them home. We used to do it by time, but as you've witnessed with the speed of storms moving, we don't delineate them by time. We go off the National Hurricane storm classifications.
Got it. So just to clarify a little bit about your ride-out crew, those are employees, are they staying at your facilities 24/7 during this time, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the ride-out crews, it's not all the employees, not a lot of employees. We'll probably bring out, we've got 4 crews of 5 operators that are normally employed here. We'll bring out 2 crews and we may enhance each one of those crews with an additional person. So we've got 12 operators that'll come out. We've got distribution mechanics, and they're the people that basically work out on the distribution system. We'll bring 2 or 3 of those out. We'll bring an electrician out, an INC tech, our gas turbine specialist. So it's a small but knowledgeable group with the expertise to be able to work on the plant should something break while they're here. But we'll call them, they'll go home, they'll pack their bags, they'll come back to work. Once they get back at work, they will stay here at the site. We have cots and pillows available for them. We spread them out, give them an office. But yeah, we button down on site. In some cases, and I'll say in some cases, and we have the flexibility in our policy to make that call, we may find hotel rooms that are nearby and put the employees in those hotel rooms just to give them a little bit more comfort. But obviously, when the storm's here and happening, we bring them on site, and we make sure that we bring them on site while they can still get on site.
Okay. So along the same lines, still touching on, closer to the storm preparations, can you elaborate a little bit on your communications with your employees? Obviously, with your ride-out crew, it's one set of communications, but with the rest of your team as well, how do you kind of go about that, and what kinds of things are you sending out to them?
Yeah, so communications are real important. We communicate via email daily on the fact that we get the weather alerts, specifically the Atlantic briefings from Storm Geo, and we'll communicate at a small group level just to let everybody know that we're looking at it on a daily basis and we're aware of anything that may be out there. As a storm approaches or enters the Gulf of Mexico, we expand that communications and we send an email out to a larger group of the supervisors and managers and executives to let them know that there's something that could be threatening us. And again, as the threat becomes larger, the communication goes wider. So when we get to the point where we're entering condition 1 or transitioning to condition 2, that's where we'll broadcast emails to all employees, letting them know what our thoughts are as far as the longevity, duration, and what the working hours are going to be. We've also got text systems set up so that we can blast out texts to employees' phones, when that's pretty popular, and a lot of people are starting to adopt that sort of text messaging system.
Great. So being in Houston, Texas, you've been through some storms in the past. What are some challenges that you've had and some lessons learned from those previous hurricane impacts?
That's a good question. So I just saw in the news the other day that we're celebrating Tropical Storm Allison's 20th birthday or anniversary. Allison was a large impact to Houston and specifically the Texas Medical Center. The amount of water that was dumped on the medical center by Allison was unprecedented. There were lots of issues with flooding, mobility around the medical center. Allison taught us a lot about flood preparedness. In response to Allison, the Texas Medical Center and the hospitals in the Texas Medical Center did a lot of renovations, installing flood walls, storm doors, underground walking basements. If you've ever walked through the things, you see these big submarine type hatches that they can close. But specifically here at TECO, we built a wall around the entire plant, and we put flood gates in that allow vehicles to go in and out, but we'll close those floodgates during storms. Our wall is built roughly 4.5 feet above the 500-year floodplain, and all that was done in response to Allison. The decision to do that was verified in 2017 when Hurricane Harvey hit. Hurricane Harvey came in, wasn't so much of a wind event, but it was a long-lasting water event, dumped a lot of water on the medical center. And again, we're located right off of Brace Bayou. We actually had the bayou come up and was touching that flood wall. So we saw water that was as bad or worse than Allison. But the fact that we had the flood wall installed and the floodgates installed, the water did not provide any challenges to PICO.
Okay. So what about kinds of lessons learned that you've also had to deal with in terms of how you respond with your employees or, supplies or things like that? Are there any lessons learned there?
Yeah, Harvey taught us a lot, and Harvey taught everybody a lot. One of the biggest things I would comment on Hurricane Harvey is the longevity of the event. Past storms, everybody who's encountered a hurricane, you gear up, it hits, it blows through, it moves on, and then you go pick up afterwards. Harvey never stopped. It just rained and rained and rained. Flood it flooded the area. Roads were unpassable. Being able to get out and around to get food or anything was nearly impossible. What Harvey taught us is that you need to be prepared for a longer duration event. We incorporated a lot of lessons learned from Harvey in the form of 7-day meal plans. So we've got a good menu. We increased the length of that menu to 7 days. It's a diverse menu. Second lessons learned is sandwiches will get you through the night, but you can't feed people for a week straight on sandwiches alone. It's extremely demoralizing. So one of the things we developed was a robust menu with steaks and good food, comfort food, so that the employee morale stayed high. When you think about storms coming in and hitting, the employees are stressed. The employees are stressed because they're here, they're in this adverse environment. But some of the other things you need to consider are the other stressors, such as the employee's house, the employee's family. There's a lot of stress during hurricanes, and so making things as comfortable at work while they're here is of utmost importance. We housed our employees on site during Hurricane Harvey, and we had bought cots for that. One of the lessons learned was that we need bigger cots. We need bigger pillows. It needs to be a little bit more comfortable. We've got replacement clothing and undergarments for the employees, but you need to make sure that you have enough of them to last a longer period of time, especially when you're expecting the employees to go out and work in wet rain here, just in a wet environment. The need to change clothes frequently is higher. And so those were a lot of the things that we learned during Harvey that we've taken response to.
Great. So that's a great point regarding employee morale, and kind of thinking about your ride out team for a long period of, a long period storm. They're having to respond for a long period of time. Would you kind of touch on, how important is that to make sure that you're including things like paying attention to employee morale in your response plan, and their quality of life? How can that affect, your hurricane response if you aren't necessarily taking those precautions?
Well, I think when you show that you're adequately prepared and you've got this plan in place and you start executing the plan and it's going well, then the employees don't have to worry about taking care of themselves while they're at work. They know you're taking care of them so they can stay focused on the job. By giving the annual training ahead of time, the employees can go home, prepare their houses and their families should a hurricane arrive. And by doing that, they are prepared to come to work and do that ride out function. So I think, again, being prepared and knowing ahead of time, having a plan, execute the plan is really allows the employee not to worry about all that other stuff and allow them to focus on the job at hand while they're at work. I'll tell you, in regard to that, success is measured by your preparation. The more prepared you are to go into a storm or into a hurricane, the more successful you'll be. Because then you just execute the plan. You're not having to think on the fly.
Definitely. In these cases especially, it's always better to be over-prepared for situations than under-prepared, for sure. Having used Storm Geo, is there a specific feature of our service that is critical to successful hurricane response at TECO?
Yeah, Storm Geo, it provides us the daily forecast and up to a week ahead of time. We look at those. We look at it for general, temperature and weather. But the biggest value, especially during hurricane season, is the daily Atlantic briefing that gets published. And that lets us look at what's going on across the entire Atlantic. We can see the storms coming off the coast of Africa, and then the narrative that goes along with it kind of gives us a probability of whether we need to worry or whether we need to start looking. Once the storm does enter the Gulf, there's specific storm advisories that get updated with storm data and the storm path projections. And those are pretty critical for us because, like I said, a lot of our policies are dependent on what the impact is to our local area. And so if there's a storm heading to southern Mexico or to Florida, we'll keep an eye on it, but we don't get geared up quite as strong or as fast. Other Storm Geo products we love is the threat updates that are specific for the location. So as a subscriber located in the Texas Medical Center, we get that custom threat update for our location here. And that way we're not worried about some other local municipalities weather predictions and trying to go off of that. We're getting specific weather predictions for our location.
Great. Well, we cherish you and your team at TECO as a client here at Storm Geo. And I want to thank you for taking the time today to kind of speak with us about your hurricane response. And we wish you the best of luck through this upcoming season. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Cortland. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you.
All right. Thank you, Jason. All right, so Jason provided some excellent real-world lessons learned. Now for a more in-depth look at how to ensure your organization and employees are prepared this season, I will turn control over to Mike for our final session today. Take it away, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Cortland, and good, I guess, afternoon, everyone. Wanted to take some time today to go over hurricane preparedness. And not just for the office and for your business, but also for your home. And as we know these days, employees in a dispersed workforce is much more common. And so even before all of this, it's always important that your employees are prepared for hurricane season as well. And Jason actually in the video brought up a lot of good points. And so you'll see a lot of those repeated here as well. So first thing I want to go into, if my slide deck will advance. Okay, consider preparedness needs for your organization, for primary work locations and also for employees at home. Of course, you want to have a response plan with a clear, actionable timeline. You want to have steps within here to prepare facilities in advance of the storm. So supplies and plans, alternate work locations. Does your facility need a hard shutdown? Because that can add some additional time and monetary aspects to it as well. And like I said, and probably will continue to repeat, several times during my presentation, ensure employees are prepared at home. That way they can return to work more quickly if they're prepared and have less of those stressors on their mind that Jason talked about as far as their homes and their families being safe from the storm itself. So developing a timeline, that's really important, obviously. And you need to identify the types of actions taken. And these can range, and I have a couple here, from making hotel reservations for your away teams to go to, and not just that, but making hotel reservations for the employees, their families, their pets. In fact, we just heard from our HR head of HR yesterday confirming that she has the proper number of people, pets, everything down for every employee, so that we have it ready should we need to move to our alternate work site if a storm threatens the Houston area. But these can also be large expenses like shutting down a refinery or shutting down, evacuating an offshore platform. And so you need to take into account the types of actions that are needed before the hurricane season so you can develop that timeline. Now, here at Storm Geo, we do have some tools, and if you're a client and you receive our trigger reports, you'll recognize these. And this is an example. I'm not going to go into big detail about what all of this means, but we have the ability to look at response plans and tie them with objective triggers. And so your actions taken might be here on the right side, and we can time our tools or tie our tools directly with them. But really what you want to do is just to have a response plan that has well-defined actions. What are you going to do? When are you going to reserve those rooms? When are you going to send employees to the alternate work site? Because you do want to get them out before mass evacuations begin happening, because otherwise you start getting into a RETA situation from 2005 potentially, where it can take several hours or days to go just what normally would be a few-hour drive up the road inland. So we at Storm Geo, we review a lot of response plans and triggers. And if you have, and we pointed out these 3 facts, if you have any of these in your response plan, it's probably good to at least review it, update it, because there are some weaknesses with these. First one being proximity to your location of the storm. And we read a lot of plans and we often see something that'll say, we will take this action 48 hours out or 24 hours out. And our first question back is, out from what? I know Cameron mentioned it in the first part of this webinar, where impacts from a storm extend obviously well beyond the center of circulation. So if you're waiting to make an action 24 hours out from the center of circulation hitting you, it's likely already too late. And so what we really focus on is the arrival time of 39-mile-per-hour winds or tropical storm force strength winds, because that's when it really starts getting dangerous to be outdoors. Things start blowing around, bridges start shutting down. And so think about that when you look at your response plan. Don't just have that out language in there. It needs to be out from something other than the center, something clearly defined. Another thing we often see is that an action's based on the storm category or Saffir-Simpson scale. You're familiar with that, category 1 through 5, but even with tropical storms, for example. Now that's fine, and we can work with that, but the problem is a lot of those storm categories only focus on one thing, and that's the max wind that's found within a storm. Saffir-Simpson's categorized it based from 1 to 5 based on the max wind. Storm category, a tropical storm. We just had Tropical Storm Claudette, which really was a fairly weak tropical storm. And you know, people see tropical storm and they think it's going to be a major impact, but you know, it really wasn't a terrible impact compared to some of the past storms we've had, other than some squalls and some bands of some heavier thunderstorms that you could normally get on a, you know, in the summer across much of the southern US. So you want to incorporate something a little bit more than that, potentially the size of the storm, because then you start talking about the impacts from storm surge. With the Hurricane Harvey example, the rainfall that could fall. Hurricane Harvey, you know, was a strong hurricane when it hit in the Corpus Christi and Rockport area, but by the time it hit the upper Texas coast, the Houston, the Beaumont area, it really wasn't much in the way of a quote unquote tropical system. The winds weren't really the big issue. It was really just the slow motion of it and the rainfall that associated with it. So keep that in mind as well. And then finally, you know, the wind ETA based solely on the forecast. That's also, it's something it's okay to have, but it's good to review that because we want to focus on probabilities, because forecasts can change from one to the next. Or one forecast you might have, you're going to have 50-mile-an-hour winds, but the next one the storm shifts away and now you're not. You don't want to be flip-flopping back and forth between actions within your response plan. So you want to have some sort of a probability tied in. So if it's greater than or equal to a certain percentage, you take those actions and then there's less fluctuations. Communication is obviously a key to a strong response. So you want to ensure your employees are aware of the forecast, aware of the response plan, or at least their parts within the response plan. Know how to communicate with each other. This is important here at Storm Geo back in 2008 with Hurricane Ike. After we returned to the office, there were still a lot of areas of town without power, without gasoline at the gas stations. And so we would communicate with one another. We found gas here, or we found gas here. And it really helps out. And another thing that's good to know about that is with communication after a storm, if cell towers are either, you know, the power's knocked out or they're jammed because of calls, text messaging is often very important because it takes much less data to get a text message through. And so that is a good tool to have. Do the employees know where to get information about returning to work? Because it's not just about the leaving and going to the alternate work site. When can they return? Yes, you want to return when the winds are below a certain speed, but what if roads are blocked? What if there's curfews? So you need to take that into consideration as well. Now, there are a couple tools that we have if you're a Storm Geo customer that an employee can go in if they have access to the portal and actually pull up the wind speed forecast for their location with their home. And it's called a wind profile generator. And it's a lesser known tool that we have. If you're on the advisory page, you can see it here, wind profile generator. But what this allows someone to do is to go in by decimal degrees, zip code, city and state, and put in your specific location, even if it's not a location that we're monitoring full time from Storm Geo, you can still put in your own location, time zone, units, and you can get a wind profile. So you can see, for example, what the winds are expected to be like over the course of the storm in a graphical format and also in a tabular format. From personal experience, Hurricane Ike again in 2008, and I apologize for bringing this one up a lot, but it was the first one that I really lived through after moving from the Midwest down here to the Gulf Coast. But I wanted to know when the winds were going to be strong, which direction they were going to be coming from, because I had a limited amount of plywood, and I wanted to know which side of my house might be better to board up, since I only have 2 or 3 pieces of plywood, and what time should I expect this to occur. So, this is some information that'll give you some ranges of what you can expect for specific locations based on latitude and longitude. We talked a lot about storm surge. We talked a lot about the water, whether it's falling from the sky or coming in from the ocean. So you want to know where you are, your business or your home, in relation to the storm surge. We have some planning layers on our portal that can show you, for a typical category 1 through 5 storm, what type of inundation can be expected. Now, there's a word of caution with this, because like Cameron said, no 2 storms are the same. It's really impossible to tell you exactly what you need to plan for a Cat 1, Cat 2. But this gives you an idea based on the surrounding topography and things like that. Now, the surge depends on the size of the storm, the angle that it hits the coast. Also, over time, surge can vary based on a development over an area. Obviously, when you have more concrete and more things being built up, it can affect surge, it can affect the rainfall, flooding, and things along those lines. But it is still good to know which area you're located in for the storm surge. Now, when we get within 48 hours of landfall, we will have a storm surge forecast where you can actually go in and see where you are. Okay, we talked about text messages, mobile apps also, very important. There are several that are available. I just have a few examples here. First and foremost, and Jason mentioned this as well, have a tool to do mass notifications and internal communications with your employees. OnSolve Mirror 3 is a good one of these. These are paid apps and paid services that you can have, but you can send out mass text messages to your employees. You can send out surveys to your employees. After a storm passes, you can ask employees, select 1 if you're half power and are up and running, select 2 if you are fine but don't have power, select 3 if you need some other type of support from the company. So these are very important to have these types of tools in your toolbox. But there's some other free weather apps that are available. Governmental apps such as the Red Cross and FEMA have free weather apps that you can download onto your phone. But even local emergency management, more and more are starting to come out with their own free mobile apps. This is the one for the county I live in, actually, Brazoria County, Texas. There's a local emergency management app that can have push notifications as well, which talk about voluntary mandatory evacuations and other types of alerts. So whether these apps are important, text messages are important, the cell phones are really a big help during these situations. And not, the Twitter. It's a potentially life-saving app platform. It's kind of funny here. It can be used for more than just celebrity gossip, that's for sure. But nearly all city, county, state, and federal emergency management departments have Twitter accounts. So they tweet and can receive tweets. So it might be good ahead of the season to go in and, follow a lot of these emergency management departments from your county, state, federal, and so that you can see what the updates are. Even school districts, if a hurricane or a tropical storm is approaching during the school year, usually in late August or September sometime, they'll keep you up to date on the status of schools with regards to closures. So Twitter is an important tool as well. So now we're going to talk about an emergency kit, and I don't want to get into all the details. This is part of a presentation that we've provided over the years directly to our clients called Employee Hurricane Preparedness Presentations. It was about getting your employees ready before the season starts to be able to not just survive, but be comfortable during a storm and be able to return to work. And this applies more today than I think than ever with the distributed workforce. Again, a lot of people working from home. And so you want to make sure you're prepared. Now, in the past, FEMA has said that you should be prepared to be self-sufficient for 72 hours. However, now they're saying 5 days. But if you look at Hurricane Lane 2018 that impacted the Hawaiian Islands, they were advising residents to have enough supplies to last 2 weeks. And that is not an exaggeration. You can be without power and the ability to go to grocery stores, gas stations, pharmacies for 2 weeks, and sometimes even more if you're in a hardest hit area. So put together your hurricane kit, flashlights, extra batteries, a first aid kit. Things I really like to point out on here is more and more you're seeing these portable power packs. So, make sure they're charged ahead of time. Make sure you have those available, charged, the weather radio, the type of things that you need to be outside, mosquito repellent, rain gear, work gloves. So you can see these. I'm not going to spend too much time on the slide reading everything, but you want to make sure you have a kit together. Now, in addition to that, the propane, without power, you need to have a way to cook. And this is home and business as well. Jason mentioned they would purchase steaks. You need a way to cook those steaks. Microwave steaks are not really good. You might like them, but a grill that you can have outside of your business or at your home, you want to have enough propane there so you can actually cook, on a gas grill or charcoal if you're using a charcoal grill, and the lighter and items like that. Sometimes there's little items that you kind of chuckle at when you see on here, but you don't want to be stuck with a charcoal fire pit and no lighter or no matches to light the fire. You could really be in a bind. Water, 1 gallon per day per person. Get it ahead of time so that you don't have to run out 2 days before a storm and come across shelves like this. Actually, most people be happy coming across a shelf like this 2 days before a storm because there actually is water left. So be prepared ahead of time. 1 gallon per day per person is important. Food, you want to have a 7-day supply. Now, if you're buying this stuff ahead of the season, you want to make sure it's stuff that's non-perishable that you can keep stored for a while. These dry fruit, powdered milk, peanut butter. And Jason also mentioned for employee morale, you can only eat so many sandwiches for so many meals for so many days in a row. So have some treats available. Steaks are a good one. Cookies, candy bars, have some things that can shake it up a little bit with your employees. Okay, 3 to 5 days before the hurricane hits, there are some other kind of broad tools that are worth noting here. You want to check your hurricane kit. Is everything there? Okay. Get plenty of extra cash from ATMs, because with power being out, credit card machines could be down, phone lines could be down. A lot of places would be cash only, and ATMs have daily limits often. So make sure you have plenty of cash on hand. Fill your gas tank in your car and have extra gas cans for your car and for your generator if you have one. My father-in-law always tells us to keep at least a half tank of gas in our cars during hurricane season, just in case we have to, evacuate or run out to Austin or Dallas or something along those lines, or go to our alternate work site. Now, my wife doesn't always do that. I try to, but it is a good practice so you're not running out and sitting in long lines at the gas station a day before the storm hits. We mentioned the propane tanks, the portable electronic gear charge, prescriptions. Make sure you have a 2-week supply, because you don't know when you're going to be able to get to that grocery store or pharmacy to pick those up. And obviously a lot of those are, critical, life-saving prescriptions that people need to have. There are some tools online, and here's a link here, and you can look at this later, from Red Cross that has the evacuation checklist, has some templates for a family communications plan, things that you might not immediately think about: pet carriers, extra clothes, shoes, can of tire sealer. So there are some resources online, so I would invite you to take a look at those when you have a chance. All right, for facilities, this is something that is well known along the coast, Gulf Coast and the East Coast. You want to have window protection. And this could be for your business, although a lot of businesses don't have the ability to do this if you're in high rises or other types of office buildings, but for your home and for your home office, window protection is important. Plywood, fabric, vinyl, PVC, Kevlar, protective screens, corrugated metal, storm shutters, whatever it might be. You want to make sure you have those cut and ready and know how to install them before the season begins. Because once that wind, a window breaks and wind gets into the structure, that can cause damage to occur much, much faster than if you keep those windows from breaking and the wind from getting inside. Here is a public service announcement: taping your windows. It is really a waste of time and it won't prevent significant damage. One thing it will do is it'll leave a sticky situation. It will, when it blows out the windows, kind of keep some of the pieces together, but it doesn't keep the windows from being blown out. It might make the cleanup a little bit easier, but like I said before, once the wind gets into your structure, it could be game over. And so don't think that taping, and don't waste your time doing that. Really, you need to have some sort of boards or some of those other items that I showed on the previous slide. Most businesses can't cover the windows, high-rise office buildings. So there are some things that you can do. Protect your electronics and sensitive equipment. Have employees move away from the windows. Store electronics away from windows and above the floor, especially if you're on a ground floor. With the storm surge, rainfall, the Harvey type incidents. So you want to make sure water doesn't get to them. So you want to elevate them, protect with plastic, and also consider the company equipment at your employees' homes. You want to make sure that they have it raised and elevated if they're on a ground floor as well, because you want to have them available to get back to work as soon as possible, but in a safe manner. Loose objects, you want to secure them. Not only can they blow around, damage the objects, damage your home or business, but for example, a trampoline in someone's backyard, those are really notorious for flipping over, and even just thunderstorms. They can also damage your home, but what if they blow into a neighbor's yard and damage their home or a neighboring business? So there's a liability aspect to it as well. So you want to secure loose objects that could be blown away, which is pretty obvious, but I still feel that it should be mentioned here. Turn off power, shut off water, empty fridge and freezer. If you've ever opened a fridge up after not having power for a week and that was not emptied ahead of time, you will never do it again. I promise you that. It is hard to get the smell away, and sometimes you can't. You just sometimes have to buy a new appliance. Do not turn off your natural gas supply, and unless you're instructed to do so by the gas company. So that's a very important tip as well. Know the evacuation routes, and I have the Houston ones here just because, you know, our company or our office here is in Houston, so we have a lot of available. Houston and Southeast Texas have a really good evacuation plan with contraflow. But what you need to do is you just need to make sure you know what the evacuation routes are. And if you need to deploy employees to a work location alternate, do it before the mass evacuations. So you can use maps, you can identify alternate routes. You should likely have a map that shows where your employees live and what surge zones they're in and evacuation zones that they're in. So you know who you need to reach out to first as far as evacuations and who you need to reach out to as far as returning to their homes or checking on them to see what kind of damage they have. And here, just in the final few slides, you know, returning to the location after the storm, you want to make sure you know and the employees are aware of travel difficulties, access that's restricted, curfews, checkpoints. So obviously you don't want to come back when the storm's still going on, but you do want to make sure that you're able to come back to, you know, at least the ability to move around and get things done. It could be rough. I mean, that's an understatement. You could have weeks without power or gas or groceries. And so you need to be prepared for that. And having all the previous steps done will help you with that. But you need to know that there could be some pods that are set up that can help you get some of the basic necessities. So just be aware of your surroundings. Even though you may not have power, the neighborhood next door might. And I know that can be frustrating. But, you know, everyone's working real hard to get everything back up and running, but just be aware of what's going on with your surroundings. And don't be this person. Danger lies everywhere with power lines. So, you know, if you're going to approach one of these power lines, just don't. Obviously, electrocution, death fire, these can energize up to 35 feet away. So stay away from that stuff. Make sure the electric company is aware of it. They likely are. They're likely very busy to restore, but just stay away. So in summary, just some of the high points: develop a hurricane plan, understand your situation, not just your situation, but your employee's situation, as far as a wind impact, surge zone, flooding zone, evacuations. You want to make sure, in addition to a plan, you have a kit with the food and the basic necessities and the water. Make preparations to secure your home or business, securing loose objects, boarding up the windows. moving electronics to a higher floor, or at least on a table or something along those lines. Have important phone numbers available. Now these days, a lot of these are already stored in our phones, so make sure you have that battery pack to charge those phones. And again, if you can't get through on a phone call, use text message. That's really a good way to get through to people. Monitor the weather from, if you have Storm Geo as your weather provider, or the National Hurricane Center, National Weather Service. Just be sure to monitor the weather and know when and if to evacuate. Having those apps, having Twitter, watching the news, listening to the radio, you should know when to evacuate. You should listen. And just like it's important to evacuate, it's also important to not evacuate if you don't need to, because that unnecessarily can tie up the roads and other resources for people that do need to evacuate off of more low-lying coastal areas, islands, barrier islands, and things like that. So know if you need to evacuate and when you should evacuate. Remember, it only takes a single storm to strike your home or business for you to have a busy hurricane season. So it could be, we could have 3 storms the entire year, but if it hits you, that's busy for you. And so we understand that, and you should be prepared for that. And with that, there's just a couple minutes left, but I can leave it open for any questions, or Cortland, I can hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Mhm.
It really does only take one storm, and it doesn't have to be a category 4 or 5 to cause major impact. Some of the most devastating storms to impact the Houston area where our offices are located were actually tropical storms when they made landfall. So each storm is unique, and we encourage you to keep that in mind and consult with the meteorologist when you make your response plans. So as Mike mentioned, we will now take a few questions before we end the webinar. There's a little time. It looks like we only have a few minutes. We do have several questions, so if we don't get to your question, we will be following up via email. So Mike, I'll direct you the first question. When you give a prediction percentage for Texas, does that mostly mean Houston?
Was that to me? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. It's for the entire Texas coast, from Brownsville all the way to Beaumont. So yeah, obviously the higher population center is in the greater Houston area, but it does mean the impact could be anywhere across the state.
Awesome, thank you. And then another question to you, Mike. Why was it advised not to turn off natural gas supply to your home?
Well, it's really never a good idea to fiddle with your natural gas supply to your home. But a lot of times what you'll see, and we've seen footage from storms, is homes on fire and things like that sitting in flooded waters. And that could be due to gas lines being left on, or accidents in turning it off the wrong way. So it's just, all in all, it's just a better option to not turn off the natural gas supply to your home anytime. But power and water, you can, feel free to go ahead and do that.
Great, thanks, Mike. And then we'll go ahead and ask one more question, Rick. Is the longer season related to our ability to detect more of the smaller storms, or is it a real trend climatologically?
Oh yeah, no, that's a good question. It's really both. It's true that with better satellite imagery, we're picking up some storms that we may never have noticed in previous years, especially early on and maybe late in the season. But the trend is also connected to the fact that we are getting warmer waters, or warm enough waters earlier, and those warm waters are lasting later into the season. And then with a slight increase in the air temperature, you get a little more evaporation. So it's really a combination of both, but there really is a climatological trend that's independent of our satellite technology. So it's both.
Awesome, thanks, Rick. So that is going to conclude our session today. As I mentioned, if we didn't get to your question, we will be following up with you via email. You should expect to receive an email by tomorrow with the recording and the slides from the presentation, some of our most popular preparedness resources, and the contact information for each of our presenters as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. And I hope you have a safe hurricane season. Thank you all.